Super Mario World overrated? Well, Brayden, let's see your arguments.
Super Mario World was released on the Super Nintendo as a launch title in 1990.
No, it was released on the Super Nintendo in 1991, although it did get a release on the Super Famicom in Japan a year earlier. And the Super Nintendo wasn't even released until 1991. So how could Super Mario World be the launch title for a system that wasn't out yet? And by the way, this is the first thing he says about this game in this video, and it's just wrong. And this is just one of several factual errors I found in this review, by the way. Here are some more.
Then, it was in the Super Mario Advance series in 2001 for Japan, and all other regions got the game in 2002. So why does other regions get the game almost a half a year later?
They didn't. Although Europe and Australia did get the game in April 2002, 5 months after the Japanese release in December 2001, the US and Mexico got the game in February 2002. 3 months later, not almost half a year later. Speaking of Mario Advanced, he brings it up near the end of the video and just makes this absolutely strange statement.
This at its core is pretty much an enhanced port. There's no drastic change from the original. But damn it, I'm disappointed that they didn't choose this game to have support for the e-reader. In the GBA version, there's minor fixes like saves, power-ups, behaviors, some minor stuff.
The ability to play as Luigi in single player, Luigi no longer being a palette swap of Mario and instead being close to how he was in Super Mario Bros. 2. Something which is noticeable through looking at his own footage, by the way, given he's playing as Luigi while he's saying this. Along with him actually mentioning the fact that in the original SNES version, Luigi is just a palette swap of Mario in this very video.
Luigi was basically using the same sprites as Mario, but the colors are opposite, so...
Which, I should note, he also complains about using this incredibly bizarre strain of logic.
It's not like this machine runs on rotary dials and punch cards. It's been almost 5 years, so I know it's not a hardware issue.
So it can't be a hardware issue because it's been 5 years since the release of the original Super Mario Bros., where Mario and Luigi were palette swaps of each other. I'm really fucking confused by this point. A status screen, a cutscene if you collect all the dragon coins, an easier time getting Yoshis that aren't green, audio clips of Mario and Luigi's voices, you know, minor stuff like that. Also, I have to take note of him listing saves as something that was changed in the remake somehow, even though the original also had a save feature. Oh, there's also this quip.
Alongside Super Mario Advance series, Super Mario World was there to make the system live a bit longer.
First off, it wasn't alongside the Advance series. The GBA port of Super Mario World was part of the Advance series. That's why it was called Super Mario Advance 2. Second off, what's with that quip about it making the system live a bit longer? The GBA was not on the verge of death in 2002 when the game came out in most of the world. Lines like that imply that Nintendo was desperate to give the GBA just a little bit of a longer lifespan when they really weren't, nor did they need to, again because the GBA was a relatively mainstream handheld at the time.
Now, of course, this is the era where video games of this style didn't have much storytelling. We didn't have the internet either to tell us what was going on. Half the time, you didn't even get on-screen prompts on what to do.
This, however, is clearly not an example of that because you are currently looking at a screen of the game communicating the story to you. Fuck, the entire basic story of this game is essentially shown to you on this screen, which not only is the first thing you see upon starting a new file, but is also a screen you show in this video just before saying this.
Princess Peach gets captured.
Hell, technically speaking, you show the same text box later in the video in the form of its appearance in the GBA remake.
And if I were to give a summary of this game right now, we can't because there is a Game Boy Advance version. Normally you would find all that stuff in an instruction manual. This would be the go-to place for everything that game itself didn't tell you. This game takes place on Dinosaur Island.
Says the instruction manual is a good place to go for the stuff the game doesn't tell you? goes on to say something the game explicitly tells you as soon as you begin it.
Yeah, this game doesn't break any boundaries in terms of graphics. Now that title goes to Doom running on a stellar 2 frames per second.
I'm not quite sure what Brayden means by this. I think he's trying to say the graphics of Mario World aren't all that impressive compared to other games at the time. And while that's at best debatable, the fact that he doesn't explain how that is, or even what he means by breaking boundaries, just makes this another meaningless statement.
Yeah, he looks like a depressed lizard.
How does he look depressed exactly? He has a cartoonishly large smile and eyes which communicate that he's happy to be on this adventure. Everything about him seems incredibly upbeat, if anything. Fuck, you even call him excited immediately after this.
Come on, he's a bit too droopy. Or a bit too excited. The overall gameplay is fine, the controls are tight, which I like. The difficulty is up there though, and I think this was a hardware thing rather than a developer thing. The enemies spawn right where you're going 90% of the time, and it doesn't help that there's a bit of popping in this game.
So I'll ignore the obviousness of saying the enemies are spawning where you're trying to go because, well, yeah, they're trying to stop you from getting where you're trying to go. Spawning in front of you, in between where you are and that final destination seems like a pretty obvious idea to me. And instead, I'll just point out that I watched this clip several times and even went through it frame by frame and could not find a single example of poppin', despite this being what he shows when he mentions it. And yeah, he complains about the difficulty quite a few times throughout this review, such as here.
World 3 was more annoying than it should be, and one of the levels has a bullshit skirting here.
That can't be!
What exactly is bullshit about it? I don't know, and he never even attempts to explain it. Oh, and there's also this little part from the same section of the video.
It could have been the fact that every video game company had to keep the video game renters in mind.
He says talking about a game that was bundled with the Super Nintendo, meaning Nintendo didn't have to keep renters in mind because if you had an SNES, you were essentially guaranteed to have a copy of Super Mario World. And that's not even the only time remembering the game was sold with the system makes a point fall apart. Take this line, for example.
Yes, I understand that you need a game that isn't too easy for people to fly, yet you don't want this game to be too difficult where they won't play this game in general and not buy the game.
But they didn't have to buy the game, they just needed to buy the Super Nintendo, and the game was included. This point doesn't make any fucking sense. Also, yeah, nobody's going to want to buy a game like Super Mario World. Hence why it sold 20 million copies in the United States. And that's just after he drops this absolute whopper on us.
It felt like Nintendo had the core audience in mind that played every previous Mario game.
First off, I have to take note of your use of Lost Levels footage to make this point, which I think is supposed to imply that Mario World is harder than Lost fucking Levels? In which case, you need to explain that one, dude. But the reason this statement baffles me so much is because any amount of research would show that's the opposite of what happened. Mario World was specifically designed to be beginner-friendly and easier than the NES Mario games.
Miyamoto stated that they made Super Mario Bros. 3 for experienced players, but wanted Super Mario World to be friendlier to beginners. Tezuka said that any time a playtester said a section was too hard, they'd scrutinise it and potentially make changes. A direct example of this is the implementation of the dotted line blocks. These are blocks that are throughout the game, covering pits and other obstacles. When the blocks are activated, the game becomes easier. Kono stated that activating all the switches made the game much easier, and it was intended that players that were having difficulty with the game would aim to activate these, whilst veteran players would leave them off. Miyamoto liked this idea because he wanted to create a game that players would be able to explore and not simply complete, so making the game easier was a prerequisite.
Of course, we have the new feather power-up. Now riddle me this, Nintendo. Why did you make it the same as the Tanuki Leaf from Mario 3?
It depends on your definition.
I mean, sure, it does allow the ability to hold the jump button rather than jam it inside your Nintendo controller. and then you can fly as long as you can keep rather than a timer. But why? I just hope this is the last time they try to recycle a power-up. Come on!
So you say the Cape Feather is the exact same as the Leaf power-up from Mario 3, list a bunch of differences between them, and then conclude by once again calling them the same. Best as I can tell, your only justification for this is that both allow you to fly. But that's an incredibly common mechanic, especially if your goal is to think of something that would make a platformer easier. Nobody would call, for example, Tails' ability to fly in Sonic 3 and Knuckles a ripoff of either the Cape Feather or the Super Leaf. Again, even ignoring the fact that in these two examples the flying mechanics work rather differently, the concept is so simplistic that using it can't really be considered copying anybody.
I would say the real issue is the game is kind of short. Just think about it. If we were to calculate the normal route and see how long that takes to get to the end of the game doesn't take long to get to the final boss and finish the game, because many people would consider that if you beat the final boss, then you finish the game. And the levels in the Star World are just bonuses.
No, not really, at least not when compared to other games from that time period. Super Mario World takes about 5 hours to beat, assuming you are only going after the main objectives. Meanwhile, it takes 4 hours to do the same with the original Donkey Kong Country, 3.5 hours to do the same with Mega Man X, and between 4 and 5 hours to beat Super Castlevania 4.
World 1's fine. It has a switch for you to press and unlocks blocks for you to use. There are colored blocks outlined that needs a switch to be pressed in order for them to show up. There's about 3 switches in the entire game.
There's 4 actually. There's yellow, green, red, and blue.
While they're not essential to beat the game, trying to 100% the game, you might need these.
What do you mean by might? You absolutely do. 100% completion in Mario World is defined as having found all 96 exits, and all 4 of the Switch Palaces count to that total. So, final thoughts? This review was utterly incoherent in several ways, and honestly, I do not feel like I got a better understanding of the game from watching it, so overall, it just failed at being a review. Good night, and good luck.